interpret reason, and then reason as the distinctive tool of science, as being reductive and utilitarian and value negating in some way. Right. Or if value freighted, then carrying the wrong kinds of value.
Yeah, so I don't want to set you up as just this sort of beating up religion sort of thing. Do you see some way of, and compare and contrast UK and US, if you wouldn't mind, some way of actually producing some sort of a rapprochement, or is it just hopeless?
Well, first on the question of beating up on religion, I think the old saying is, if you don't fight, you lose by default. I mean, so the thing to do is realize that religion is so present and pervasive in society. That's something which is almost an absurd remark in the United States context, given the power of the evangelical lobby and the rest. But it's pervasive even in the United Kingdom. I mean, the Church of England, for example, is established, and it runs a very large percentage of the primary schools and a significant percentage of the secondary schools. Very many of the schools in England now are faith-based. They have some kind of faith connection. A prayer is said in the Houses of Parliament every morning when the session starts. I mean, in all sorts of ways, religion is part of the very fabric of the society.
And there's been a huge injection of influx of Muslims as well.
That's true. So, and in fact, it's mainly the Islamic community which has been very vocal, wanting, sort of the same sorts of privileges and attention that the Church of England and the Catholic community have got from the government. So wanting tax money for their faith schools and wanting a say, perhaps representation in the House of Lords, where 26 bishops of the Church of England sit by right and a number of others who've been made life peers. So, there is a very pervasive and, up until recently anyway, silent presence, unobvious presence, let me say, in the public square of the religious voice, out of all proportion to their actual representation in society. I mean, I very often find myself on a panel with a Jewish person, a Muslim person, a Catholic person, an Anglican person, and then me, and I'm the token atheist, secularist, humanist, and because I've got long hair, sort of, if they didn't find a lady to come along, so I'm that representative of all those positions. And between the four of them, they represent an active constituency in the society of about 8% of people who go every week to church or mosque or temple. And I represent a majority of people in the society who are fundamentally secularist. Whether or not they're religious, they still think that the public square ought to be mainly a secular domain. And the reason why there are four of them and one of me is because they can't agree with one another. That's just, sort of part of the premise. So I always say in these situations that there's a big distortion in the debate, and the distortion comes from the side of the religious voice in the debate. That's why I think that Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, other people who stand up and flourish their boxing gloves at the religious lobby are right to do so, because there has to be an argument in order to bring that up and somewhat to keep, play the Canute thing of trying to keep the tide of religious influence a little bit back.
If you hadn't been a philosopher, I'm just a little thought here, if you hadn't been a philosopher, what would you have liked to have been instead?
It's a tough question, that, actually, because there are so many things. I mean, a musician would have been one thing one would have liked to be.
Do you play?
Yeah, I do, yeah. A multi-millionaire would have been another thing that would have been very nice, because that would have opened a lot of options, I suppose. But I suppose musician mainly. Having the hairstyle already, you see.
Right, that's sort of the Beethoven thing, wouldn't it? Yeah. Do you, what got you first interested in science as opposed to philosophy? I mean, is there something that came up in your schooling, or?
Well, I went to a boarding school, where too early, really, in the sort of English tradition, you had to choose between the art side and the science side. And just, I suppose, the accident of having a facility with the classical languages and English literature and that kind of thing meant that my teachers at school pushed me in the direction of the art side. I'm not sorry about it at all, because I think if you're reasonably alert and you like to read, you're not going to lose out too much, although at some point, had we an ideal educational system, one would have been given more opportunity to learn something really in-depth and first-hand, young, in the sciences. But that's, broadly speaking, what happened, yeah.
When I was back in England recently, there was a piece in one of the newspapers, I think it was the Times, and it was that time of year when they were about to elect a poet laureate, and there was a comment that perhaps that was old-fashioned and redundant, and what we needed now was a sort of a philosopher-in-chief or a thinker-in-chief, somebody who actually could do something useful, and your name was mentioned, so was Jonathan Glover, who was also in the room, I noticed. Is there a greater tradition of public intellectuals in the UK in your experience, because you work both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah.
And
well,
why?
I mean, I think it's a difficult one. This one, it's difficult to generalize about the Anglophone sphere in a way, because there are some notable and very admirable public intellectuals in the United States. Now, the tradition of the public intellectual in continental Europe, especially among the French, the Germans, and the Italians, is very strong. In France, for example, public intellectuals are sort of stars. I mean, if you think there are some who wear their shirts wide open, show off their chests, and appear on television and wave their hands around. I think that to some extent now too. And they have a really wonderfully accepted role in society. Theirs is a voice which adds, I think, considerably to the public debate, and they're welcomed, therefore, by their societies. In the UK, there's always been a great deal of suspicion about intellectuals in general, public or private. There's the old saying, mention the word intellectual and I reach for my gun, and all that very much applies there. So we don't think in those terms very much, despite the fact that the public debate in the UK is, I think, very rich in intellectual voices, except they don't present themselves as such. If you look at the broadsheet newspapers, for example, there's a lot of very interesting comment, a lot of very smart people who write for them, and a very lively debate goes on, without it being pretentious and without it setting itself up as the sort of cafe philo society. That's exactly as it should be, and one's very grateful for it, because no matter what the point of view, at least the points of view are being expressed, and there's this. It's not a babel of voices. I think it's an exciting kind of disco of voices, if you like, out there, which means that if you track back over the last 12 months or 5 years of public debate in the UK, you'll see that most of the things that we've just been mentioning now, at one point or another, will have come up and done so in the broadsheets and in the public broadcasts.
Yeah. So, but if you have universities actually closing departments of, say, chemistry and so on, how do you justify keeping open philosophy departments? I mean, what is the function that's being performed by learning and teaching philosophy?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be said there is that the university sphere and the intellectual sphere, if you like, have never been coterminous in England, nor have they overlapped all that much, which I think is a pity. If you go back to the 19th century, the universities that existed then, to a greater extent the old universities, lesser extent the civic universities, were places, strictly speaking, of education, not so much of research and not so much of public challenge and public debate. Mm-hmm. The research institutions were the Royal Societies, the Royal Society itself, the Royal Geographical Society, the Royal Geological Society. When Darwin came back from his travels, he didn't go and lecture in Cambridge, he went and lectured at the Geological Society. Mm-hmm. What we've seen in the 20th century with the professionalization of the humanities and the fact that now people are paid salaries all their working lives long to be philosophy professors and so on, is a sort of niching or pigeonholing of people who really in another age might have been much more general in their output and in whom they addressed in their work, making them specialists and technicians. I mean, if you want to get anywhere in the academic profession, you have to do technical work that will pass muster with your professional colleagues and get into peer-reviewed journals and so on. Otherwise, you just don't get anywhere. But that kind of work is far too specialized for the general debate. And so we've had this separation of the intellectual sphere from the academic sphere. And that means that, when funding problems come up and when universities run out of money, one of the reasons why they start cutting departments is because nobody out there in the general square cares about it so much. But your question was, why keep philosophy departments open when chemistry departments are closing? And I think there's a serious point.